Late autumn, 1945. A narrow room inside a former schoolhouse in southern England. The war has ended, but the air still carries its weight. The walls are bare. A single table. 2 chairs. No flags. No uniforms of authority. Only paper, pencils, and silence. A German officer sits alone. His field-gray tunic is gone. In its place, a plain jacket. No medals. No rank, insignia. The man who once commanded battalions now waits to be questioned like a civilian. Outside, rain taps against the window, steady and indifferent. For 6 years, he had spoken only in certainty. Victory duty, obedience, orders passed downward, never questioned. But now, the Reich is ashes. Hitler is dead. The salutes have stopped. An Allied intelligence officer opens a file. Inside are maps, casualty reports, intercepted orders, and blank pages reserved for something else. The questions begin calmly. Not accusations, not threats, just facts. And slowly, something changes. The officer exhales, his shoulders lower. His words no longer follow doctrine. For the first time, he speaks without fear of consequences. What emerges is not propaganda but admission. To understand why these confessions mattered, we must return to the world that shaped these men long before the interrogations ever began. In September 1939, when German forces crossed into Poland, the officer corps believed they were witnessing the rebirth of a nation's military destiny. For many of them, this was not merely war, it was correction, a reversal of humiliation. The defeat of 1918 had never fully left their minds. Versailles was not history. It was grievance. The men who wore German uniforms at the outbreak of the war were not reckless fanatics. Most were trained professionals, shaped by Prussian discipline and interwar restraint. They had studied failure carefully. They believed they had learned from it. And in the early years, everything seemed to confirm their confidence. Poland collapsed in weeks. France fell in 6. Norway, the Low Countries. Each campaign reinforced the belief that German arms were not just superior, but destined. Officers spoke of tempo, coordination, initiative. They believed their doctrine had finally solved the problem of modern war. Behind closed doors, many credited leadership, not ideology. They saw themselves as technicians of conflict, not political actors. Hitler to them was a catalyst rather than a commander. He approved plans, not details. He inspired will, not method. That distinction mattered to them. It allowed obedience without self-examination. The officer corps prided itself on professionalism. Orders were executed cleanly. Personal doubts, if they existed, were private. Publicly, confidence was absolute. This culture rewarded certainty and punished hesitation. To question strategy was not just disloyal, it was unmanly. Early victories reinforced a dangerous illusion that speed equaled control. That shock equaled dominance. That enemies would always break before Germany's will did. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 pushed this belief to its peak. Never before had an army advanced so far, so fast. Encirclements destroyed entire Soviet formations. Captured territory stretched beyond maps used in staff colleges. Officers wrote letters home describing history in motion. But even in triumph, subtle fractures appeared. Supply lines strained. Equipment wore down faster than expected. Soviet resistance did not vanish, it hardened. Winter approached with an indifference that doctrine could not overcome. Still, few officers voiced concern openly. Uches had become habit. Doubt felt like betrayal. More importantly, authority began to shift. Hitler intervened more frequently. Decisions once made by staff officers were now dictated from above. Some noticed. Most adjusted. The culture of obedience absorbed the change without protest. In public briefings, officers spoke of inevitability. In private moments, some wondered how long momentum could substitute for strategy. By the end of 1941, Germany stood deeper inside enemy territory than any army in its history. On paper, it was unmatched. In reality, something essential had begun to erode: not strength, but certainty, and once certainty weakens, truth finds space to grow. By early 1942, the war no longer felt distant to German officers. It pressed inward into supply rooms, command tents, and sleepless nights. Victory was still spoken of, but now it required explanation. Justification. Time. The first shock came not with a single defeat, but with accumulation, losses that could not be replaced. Equipment that arrived late or not at all. Men who no longer believed the war would end quickly. On the Eastern Front, the scale of combat stripped away illusions. Entire divisions vanished into snow and mud. Not in dramatic collapse, but in slow erosion. Stalingrad became the psychological breaking point. For the officer corps, it was not just a military defeat, it was a betrayal of everything they had been taught. Encirclement was supposed to be something Germany inflicted, not suffered. Withdrawal was a tactical necessity, not a moral failure. Yet orders came forbidding retreat. Flexibility, the creed of German doctrine, was replaced by rigidity. Officers obeyed, some argued, none disobeyed. When the Sixth Army surrendered in February 1943, the news rippled through command structures like a silent earthquake. Official statements framed it as heroic sacrifice. Privately, officers understood what it meant. An entire army had been lost not to enemy brilliance alone, but to refusal to adapt, to retreat, to admit error. At the same time, the war reached Germany itself. Allied bombing campaigns transformed cities into front lines. Officers returning on leave walked through ruins where streets once stood. Families lived underground. The home front, once abstract, became personal. Confidence eroded further as Allied forces demonstrated growing coordination. In North Africa, German commanders faced enemies who learned quickly. In Italy, terrain that should have favored defense became a grind of attrition. Every theater demanded more resources than Germany could provide. Leadership dynamics worsened. Hitler's distrust of his generals hardened into control. Orders became increasingly detailed, increasingly unrealistic. Officers learned to phrase reports carefully, truth filtered through optimism to avoid reprimand. Honest assessment became dangerous. Some officers began to admit something privately, never aloud. The enemy was stronger than expected, not just numerically, but industrially. Logistically, psychologically, the Allies could absorb losses Germany could not, and yet surrender remained unthinkable. The officer corps was bound by oath, honor, and fear. Not fear of death, but fear of being remembered as the man who broke. They had been trained to endure, to hold, to obey. Those virtues, once strengths, now became traps. By 1944, the invasion of Normandy confirmed what many already knew, but refused to articulate. The Western Allies were not weak. They were methodical, overwhelming, and patient. German counterattacks lacked fuel, air cover, and reserves. Every report painted the same picture from different fronts. Decline. Still. Orders were executed. Still. Reports spoke of temporary setbacks. Inside the minds of many officers, two wars now existed. One on paper, still winnable. Another, in reality, slipping Hawaii. That internal conflict between duty and perception would define what they later admitted when the war finally ended. Because once the uniforms were removed and the oaths dissolved, those buried thoughts would no longer remain silent, and that silence would soon break. German officers were trained to project composure. Fear, in their culture, was something enlisted men managed, not commanders. In official correspondence and after-action reports, emotion had no place. But in captivity, stripped of command and consequence, many finally acknowledged what had shaped their decisions all along. They admitted fear not of death, but of failure, of disgrace. Disgrace, of being judged by peers more than by history. The German officer corps was insular. Reputation mattered. To be seen as weak was to be erased. That fear encouraged conformity even when orders made no sense. Several officers later admitted they recognized disastrous decisions as they were issued. Yet they complied. Not because they believed in them, but because disobedience felt like personal annihilation. The system had trained them well enough to suppress instinct in favor of obedience. Interrogators noticed a pattern. Once officers realized they were no longer being evaluated by German superiors, their tone changed. Voices softened. Statements grew reflective. Many described an internal tension between professional judgment and imposed loyalty. That tension, unresolved during the war, became confession afterward. Fear had not vanished in victory. It had simply changed form. Another admission surfaced repeatedly. Exhaustion not physical, but moral. Officers spoke of a weariness deeper than fatigue. A slow erosion of meaning. They had entered the war believing in order, hierarchy, and clarity. What they experienced instead was endless contradiction. Orders contradicted reality. Reports contradicted observation. Public narratives contradicted private knowledge. Maintaining those contradictions required constant Over time, that effort became unbearable. Some officers admitted they stopped thinking strategically altogether. They focused on survival, on preserving what remained of their units. On avoiding attention from above, morality narrowed to immediate obligation. Keep men alive today, postpone disaster tomorrow. When questioned about atrocities, responses varied, but a common thread emerged. Many did not deny knowledge. They admitted awareness. What they denied was agency. They described themselves as cogs, uncomfortable but necessary. In hindsight, some acknowledged that this self-image had been convenient. The war demanded silence. That silence corroded them. Only after defeat did they confront the weight of what had been ignored. Not in dramatic remorse, but in subdued recognition. The realization that obedience had not absolved them, it had defined them. Perhaps the most striking post-war admission concerned leadership. Early in the war, officers separated Hitler from military operations. Later, they could not. By 1943, many privately recognized that strategic direction was flawed at the highest level. They admitted they no longer believed in ultimate victory, but continued to speak as if they did. This duality became routine: public confidence, private resignation. Several officers described moments when they knew the war was lost, not at a single battle but gradually, through patterns. Resources declining, allies advancing, commands repeating themselves despite failure. What they admitted afterward was not just disbelief but resentment. Resentment at being forced to execute orders that contradicted everything they had been trained to do. Yet even resentment did not lead to rebellion. The culture of obedience remained stronger than judgment. When interrogators asked why they did not act sooner, responses were quiet. There was no dramatic justification, only acknowledgement that the system they served had taught them not to. And that realization, perhaps more than any battlefield defeat, marked the true turning point. Because once belief collapses, only momentum remains. And momentum, eventually, runs out. During the war, German officers routinely underestimated their enemies in official assessments. Allied forces were described as slow, poorly coordinated, or technically inferior. After capture, that narrative collapsed almost immediately. In post-war interrogations, many officers admitted that Allied strength was not accidental, it was systemic. They spoke candidly about industrial capacity, logistical depth, and an ability to replace losses that Germany simply did not possess. What impressed them most was not individual bravery, but endurance. The Americans, mastered large-scale coordination faster than expected. Their learning curve was steep, but once lessons were absorbed, they were applied relentlessly. British forces, often mocked early in the war, demonstrated resilience and institutional memory. They adapted without panic. German officers confessed that by 1944, Allied air superiority alone had changed the nature of command. Movements were constrained. Daylight operations became hazardous. Initiative, once the cornerstone of German doctrine, was reduced to reaction. Several officers acknowledged something that wartime propaganda denied. The Allies fought a war of systems. Germany fought a war of improvisation. Against overwhelming resources, improvisation could only delay defeat. These were not grudging compliments. They were acknowledgments of reality that could only be spoken once. denial no longer served survival. Another admission emerged quietly but consistently: the myth of infallible German tactics. Officers acknowledged that early successes had obscured structural weaknesses. Blitzkrieg was effective but situational. It relied on surprise, fuel, air support, and initiative. When those elements disappeared, the doctrine faltered. Captured officers admitted that German planning often assumed ideal conditions. Contingencies were limited. Once momentum stalled, adaptability declined. The same rigidity imposed by high command filtered downward. They also admitted that German command culture discouraged bad news. Reports were shaped to match expectations. Problems were minimized. Failures were over time, decision-makers operated on distorted information. This self-reinforcing loop, they acknowledged, was fatal. By the time truth reached the top, it was often too late to act. In captivity, officers spoke with a clarity absent during the war. They recognized that their reputation for tactical brilliance had become a trap, encouraging risk without margin, confidence without reserve. What they finally admitted was sobering. Germany had not lost because it lacked skill. It lost because it mistook early success for permanence. Perhaps the most revealing angle was how German officers described the enemy after the war, not as caricatures, but as professionals. They admitted that Allied commanders respected logistics as much as courage, that Allied armies valued coordination over spectacle, that patience, not aggression, often decided outcomes. One recurring admission stood out: the Allies planned for survival. German plans assumed sacrifice. That difference shaped everything. German officers realized too late that wars are not won by intensity alone. They are won by sustainability, by morale that can be renewed, by systems that forgive mistakes. In the end, what they admitted was not admiration but recognition. Recognition that the enemy they dismissed had understood modern war more completely. And once that realization settled in, another truth followed. The war had been lost long before the final surrender. What remained was the moment when denial finally gave way to confession. That moment arrived not on the battlefield but in captivity. The moment did not arrive with a single surrender. It arrived gradually, as German officers crossed invisible thresholds from command to captivity, from authority to anonymity. By late 1944, capture no longer carried the same stigma it once had. Entire formations, surrender intact. Staff officers destroyed papers, burned maps, and waited. For many, the act of laying down arms was not dramatic. It was administrative, a final duty performed with mechanical calm. Interrogation began almost immediately. Allied intelligence services were prepared not only to extract information, but to listen. They understood that these men had spent years performing certainty. What they wanted now was reflection. The early interviews were cautious. German officers recited familiar lines. They emphasized discipline. They blamed circumstances, weather, resources, luck. But as days turned into weeks, the environment changed. There were no threats, no humiliation, just repetition. The same questions asked differently. And slowly, answers shifted. Officers began correcting themselves. Qualifiers appeared. Hesitation replaced certainty. They admitted confusion during operations they had once described as controlled. They acknowledged orders that contradicted reality. They spoke of moments when they knew objectives were unattainable. One recurring admission stood out. Many had stopped believing in victory long before the end. Some as early as 1943, others after Normandy. A few admitted they knew the war was lost, even earlier, but lacked the language to express it. Interrogators noted that Rand influenced Kanda. Senior officers spoke of systems and strategy. Junior officers spoke of exhaustion and fear. But across ranks, a pattern emerged once officers realized their words no longer affected careers. Truth replaced performance. Another shift occurred when Hitler's death was confirmed. For years, officers had framed loyalty around him, even when they disagreed. With that anchor gone, explanations collapsed. There was no longer a need to justify obedience. Some officers admitted resentment openly. Others spoke with detached calm. A few expressed shame not for defeat, but for silence. silence maintained out of habit rather than belief. Importantly, these admissions were not emotional confessions. They were measured, controlled, almost clinical. These men were not seeking absolution. They were explaining themselves perhaps for the first time. What surprised Allied interrogators most was consistency. Officers captured in Italy echoed those from the Eastern Front. Naval officers shared conclusions with army commanders. The language differed. The substance did not. They admitted that they had understood the imbalance, that they recognized industrial disparity, that they knew Allied air power had changed everything, that they obeyed orders they believed were wrong, not out of fanaticism but conditioning. By early 1945, as Germany collapsed, the admissions grew sharper. Officers spoke of inevitability, of momentum, of how the war had continued long after its outcome was decided, and with each statement, a deeper truth emerged. The German officer corps had not been blind. It had been silent. And that silence, once broken, revealed more than any battlefield report ever could, because the final admissions, the ones that mattered most, were still ahead. They would come not from analysis, but from reckoning. The breaking point came when explanation turned into acknowledgement. By the spring of 1945, Germany no longer existed as a functioning state. Communications collapsed, commands fragmented, officers surrendered without knowing whether their superiors were alive, captured, or already dead. In Tapacum, something fundamental shifted. Interrogations changed tone. Allied officers stopped asking what had happened and began asking why, not accusatory. Methodical. They wanted to understand decision-making under collapse. That was when the most revealing admissions emerged. Captured German officers began to speak openly about Hitler not as a symbol, but as a liability. They admitted that by 1943, many high-ranking officers no longer trusted his judgment. Some described his strategic directives as detached from reality. Others spoke of meetings where dissent was suppressed by intimidation rather than argument. What they admitted, carefully, was that fear had replaced respect. Fear of removal, fear of disgrace, fear of being labeled Hitler's control did not rest solely on ideology, it rested on unpredictability. Officers learned that survival depended on compliance, not competence. Several officers admitted that the July 1944 assassination attempt confirmed what many already believed, that the war could not be won under existing leadership. Yet even resistance remained limited. The failure of the plot reinforced caution. Silence became safer than action. When questioned about the continuation of the war after clear defeat, officers offered a sobering explanation. They said the system had lost the ability to stop itself. Orders continued because no one possessed the authority or courage to contradict them openly. Some officers acknowledged they hoped for external resolution, that the enemy would end the war for them, that surrender, not rebellion, would be the final act. The most striking admissions concerned inevitability. Many officers stated plainly that by late 1944, they knew Germany could not recover. The Ardennes offensive, they admitted, was not a bid for victory, but a postponement of collapse. It was a gamble taken without belief, executed because not executing it was unthinkable. When interrogators asked why they continued to send men into hopeless situations, answers were quiet. They spoke of duty stripped of meaning, of momentum without purpose, of a machine that no longer responded to reason. There were no grand defenses, no attempts to rewrite history. Only recognition. Recognition that obedience had become automatic, that loyalty had outlived judgment, that professional pride had delayed honesty. Some officers admitted something even more unsettling, that they felt relief upon capture. Not relief from danger, but from responsibility. For the first time in years, they no longer had to pretend certainty, no longer had to issue orders they did not believe in. This admission disturbed Allied interrogators. It suggested that the German military had continued fighting not because it believed in victory, but because it could not imagine stopping. By the time formal surrenders were signed in May 1945, the psychological war was already over. The battlefield defeat merely confirmed what many officers had already accepted privately. The breaking point, then, was not the fall of Berlin. It was the moment when silence became unnecessary, and once that silence lifted, the war's final chapter shifted from combat to analysis, from action to consequence, because what these admissions revealed would shape how the world understood the conflict long after the last shots were fired, and that understanding would begin to take form in the aftermath. When the war ended, Allied intelligence services faced a task that extended beyond victory. They were not only cataloging documents or dismantling military structures, they were studying a mindset. The admissions of captured German officers were treated as data valuable, revealing, and instructive. British and American analysts compared interrogation transcripts, memoir drafts, and psychological profiles. What emerged was not a portrait of madness, but of compliance. Allied reports noted how consistently German officers described the same internal pressures: obedience over initiative, loyalty over judgment, structure over conscience. These were not qualities imposed suddenly by the Nazi state. They had existed long before, cultivated through tradition and reinforced by fear. Intelligence officers concluded that the German military had not collapsed solely due to battlefield defeat. It had hollowed itself out from within. Decision-making had narrowed. Feedback loops had broken. Honest reporting had disappeared. By the final year's command, operated inside an echo chamber. The admissions also reshaped Allied understanding of responsibility. The line between ideological fanatic and professional soldier proved less clear than anticipated. Many officers were not driven by belief in Nazi doctrine, but neither were they neutral. Their silence enabled outcomes they later claimed to regret. This realization influenced post-war policy. Allied planners recognized that future conflicts would not be decided only by weapons or numbers. They would hinge on command culture, on whether systems allowed dissent, on whether failure could be acknowledged without punishment. Psychological warfare units studied the admissions closely. They noted that German officers responded not to humiliation, but to removal of pressure. When rank, reputation, and consequence disappeared, truth followed. This insight would shape interrogation, doctrine, and influence, Cold War intelligence methods. There was also disappointment. Some Allied analysts had hoped for clearer expressions of remorse. What they encountered instead was restraint. Officers rarely pleaded innocence or guilt. They spoke in terms of process, not morality. That detachment unsettled their listeners. Yet the value of the admissions lay precisely there. They revealed how ordinary professional structures could be bent toward destructive ends without overt fanaticism, how competence could coexist with catastrophe. The final Allied conclusion was sobering. Germany had not been defeated by ignorance. It had been defeated by a system that trained its leaders to obey too well. That lesson would not remain confined to reports and archives. It would shape how post-war Europe rebuilt its institutions, and how military leadership was taught in the decades that followed. But the impact of these admissions did not end with analysis. They also reshaped Germany itself, because the men who had spoken in captivity would eventually return home into a nation forced to confront what obedience had cost it. And that confrontation would define the next chapter. When German officers began returning from captivity in the late 1940s, they returned to a country that no longer recognized itself. Cities lay flattened. Borders had shifted. Institutions that once demanded obedience now demanded explanation. The admissions made in Allied custody did not remain sealed. Some surfaced through testimony. Others appeared in memoirs, lectures, and quiet conversations. Together, they formed an uncomfortable counter-narrative to wartime myths. For years, the German officer corps had been portrayed by itself, and others as apolitical, professional, detached from ideology. Post-war reality challenged that image. The truth was more complex. Officers had not designed the system, but they had sustained it. In early West German military and political discussions, this tension became unavoidable. How could a new armed force be built without repeating the past? How could authority be restored without blind obedience? Former officers participated in these debates with caution. Some defended their actions as unavoidable. Others acknowledged failure not in combat, but in judgment. They admitted that professionalism without moral boundary was not neutrality, but abdication. The admissions forced German society to reconsider responsibility. Blame could no longer be isolated at the top. It had to be distributed across structures, habits, and silences. This realization was painful, but necessary. Military education changed. Initiative was reframed as obligation, not risk. Obedience was redefined as conditional, not absolute. Officers were taught to question orders that violated law or reason. These reforms were not immediate, nor were they universally accepted, but they were informed directly by the lessons of collapse. Public memory evolved unevenly. Some veterans resisted introspection. Others embraced it quietly. Over time, the narrative shifted from heroic endurance to tragic consequence. The war was no longer discussed solely in terms of sacrifice, but of choices unmade. What lingered most powerfully was the recognition that defeat had not arrived suddenly. It had been visible long before surrender, but acknowledging it required courage the system had not allowed. The admissions of captured officers became a mirror reflecting not just what had happened, but how it had been permitted. Germany rebuilt itself around that mirror, imperfectly but deliberately. And as decades passed, those early post-war confessions gained weight not as excuses, but as warnings. Warnings about what happens when institutions value obedience over conscience. Warnings about how silence can outlast belief. Warnings written not in propaganda, but in quiet, measured admissions made after everything else was already lost. All that remained was to ask what these truths meant beyond Germany. Because the lessons carried by those officers did not belong to one nation alone. They belonged to history itself. The admissions of captured German officers did not arrive with drama. There were no grand confessions, no sudden moral awakenings. What emerged instead was something far more unsettling: clarity. These men did not describe themselves as monsters. They described themselves as professionals who stopped questioning, as leaders who mistook discipline for virtue, as officers who learned too late that obedience, when detached from judgment, becomes its own form of failure. Their words remind us that modern wars are not sustained by hatred alone. They are sustained by systems, by routines, by cultures that reward silence and punish dissent. The German military did not collapse because its officers were ignorant of reality. It collapsed because they recognized reality but felt unable to act upon it. History often searches for villains who shout. What these admissions reveal is the danger of those who comply quietly. The officers spoke of fear not of death, but of standing apart. They feared being isolated more than being wrong. In that fear, they surrendered their most important responsibility: the duty to think independently when lives depend on it. Their post-war reflections were not attempts to rewrite the past. They were acknowledgments of how isolé, professional competence can coexist with moral paralysis, how tradition can outlive purpose, how momentum can replace meaning. The lesson is not confined to one army or one era. Every institution that values efficiency over conscience risks repeating the same pattern. Every system that discourages honest dissent moves closer to collapse, even if it appears strong. The war ended in ruins, but the truth emerged afterward in plain rooms, over quiet conversations, spoken by men who no longer had anything to gain from silence. Those admissions do not absolve them. They warn us, because the most dangerous failures in history are not always driven by belief. They are driven by obedience without reflection. And once reflection disappears, defeat becomes inevitable long before the final surrender is signed.